Happiness through curiosity on the Ranveer Show. Welcome to TRS Clips. What's happened in the last 30 years in America?
A whole lot has happened in America and the world. First of all, we had the end of the Cold War, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain came down, communism was defeated, the USSR broke up, the US won, and everything was supposed to be great ever after. All the world's problems were over. There would be democracy and peace and love and liberalism everywhere, and the world would be the greatest place ever for forever, essentially. But that's not quite what happened. We are an aggressive warlike species, and we have had wars after war after war. You had the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in the early 90s. I think it was 91. Then you had a war in the Balkans. It was part of the Soviet bloc. Then the entire country, Yugoslavia, disintegrated and all these small little nations came out of that. It was a continuation of a very old conflict that began even before World War I. So that's what happened. The US had a major role to play in that. Then you had the second Gulf War, in which Saddam Hussein was finally ousted and eventually he was dispatched. Then you had Libya and you had all kinds of other things that happened. You had unipolarity for quite some time after 1991. The world was the unipolar place. There was only one superpower. And then you saw the rise of China, the continuing ascent of China to a major role to play in the geopolitical global scenario. China is not quite a superpower yet, but it aspires to be one. It aspires to replace the US as the sole superpower in the next 20, 30 years maximum.
Okay, I have to dial back a little bit to the start of this podcast and the end of the last one. We spoke about the Cold War and broke down the geopolitical angles and the psychology behind the Cold War. As always, it was for money and it was for power and it was for territory. But it was masked as a fight between two ideologies. On one side, we have the capitalistic democratic USA, and on the other side, we have the communist Russia, basically. Eventually, Russia loses. Now, this is the gimmick that we're speaking about. Do you think that American officials actually believe that their ideology would sustain in the long term? That's one question. And two, what was the need to go to war if your main rival has already been ousted? If that main rival is already crumbling and is dying, why should a country go to war? Is it for further expansion? Is it to strengthen your position at the top? What's the logic and the psychology of American officials in the early 90s, according to you?
So it's all about consolidating power and accessing the most amount of resources. So what was happening is that Saddam Hussein was an ally of the US. He was essentially a client of the US. The Americans had this dispute, this conflict with the Iranians that dates back to 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, in which the US-backed puppet Shah of Iran was ousted. An Islamic government came into power, led by the Ayatollahs, Ayatollah Khomeini, and so on. And they took lots of Americans hostage. The American embassy was stormed and all that. So Iran became a big enemy of the US, and the US wanted retribution. They wanted to take revenge for that, and they wanted to punish Iran for behaving in this manner. So they utilized Iraq as the proxy for bleeding Iran. And then you had a long-standing conflict, the Iran-Iraq war that went on for the best part of a decade. So that is how they used Saddam Hussein. So they gave Saddam Hussein everything he wanted, Western support, arms, ammunition, money, most likely, and they propped him up and they used him as the tool to blunt Iran with. Now, the war eventually ground down to a stalemate, and they eventually had a ceasefire. And then I think Saddam Hussein started becoming too big for his boats and too big for the Americans' liking. He wanted to, what he did, the Americans led him to believe that they were in favor of him invading and taking over Kuwait. Kuwait is a major, small little country, but it's a major oil producer. And Saddam Hussein wanted to take over Kuwait and enrich himself at their expense. So the Americans kind of led Saddam Hussein to believe that it was okay to go ahead and do this. And the moment he did that, they declared war on him. So they created this entire coalition of multiple parties, multiple powers. I believe India was also invited. India refused most likely at that time. India was not a major geopolitical player at the time. So there was this war in 1991. I think it was in February 91. I was a kid at the time, but I kind of remember that. So there was an invasion of Iraq, a massive shock and awe campaign. I don't even know how many civilians were wiped out in that, but yeah, it's all right as long as the US does it. Massive aerial bombardment of Baghdad. There was bombardment in other places as well. Civilian targets were wiped out, flattened to the ground. Basra was targeted. Many other places were targeted. And the Iraqi country was devastated. The nation of Iraq was devastated. There was massive destruction, lots of casualties. Saddam Hussein remained in power. And then there was the final act of the war was the highway of death, in which massive convoys of Iraqi military vehicles retreating from Kuwait, going back into Iraq, were just wiped out from the air. Massive, just a massacre all across the highway. The photographs are horrible. It was a plain massacre. They were not trying to fight back, but that's what happened. But as long as you're killing the bad guy, it's all right? So that's what the US did. And they were not able to dislodge Saddam Hussein. That thing was done later on in 2003.
Thank you for watching this clip. If you want to learn more about this topic, we've curated a playlist just for you, and here's a link to the whole episode.